Thanks very much for joining us in this side event late through the negotiations. You must all be tired, but we really appreciate you coming, and I think we've got a really exciting panel today, so I think it's really kind of worth bringing this to the end. So today we're going to be exploring attributing extreme weather events to climate change and what's the role of communication in that. So we've got a really brilliant panel with us here today, and what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce them all briefly to you. Then we're going to hear a little bit from them about their work, and then we're going to open up and have a more interactive conversation between them and with you, if any questions come to mind, to explore some of these things in a bit more detail. And my name is Dr. Susanna Fisher, and I work at University College London, and I have the privilege of moderating the fantastic colleagues here today. So I'm going to start with, on my left, we have Dr. Freddie Otto, who has been leading an organization called the World Weather Attribution since its founding with others. The World Weather Attribution has conducted more than 50 studies looking at attributing extreme weather events to climate change. She's also an academic at Imperial, which I'm sure she'll share more about her work. Then we have to her left, we have Dr. Joyce Kimutai, also a member of WWA, a climate scientist and performing a very important role also in Kenya as part of her role here on the negotiations team. Then to her left, we have Professor Krishna Rao, who's a professor at IIT Delhi, works particularly on atmospheric science, event attribution as part of the broader WWA family. And then last but not least, very far on the left there, we have Dr. Benjamin Strauss, who's the CEO of Climate Central, a research and policy comms organization based in the US, also and the chief scientist of that organization, working very much on attribution and new tools such as the Climate Shift Index. So I'm going to ask Dr. Otto to start us off with a little introduction to what do we mean by attribution.
Yeah, thanks very much. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here at this late event. So we are in the era of loss and damage, and the opening of this COP has made that again very clear. And the reason that we actually know that we are in the era of loss and damage is because of attribution. So the science of attribution answers the question in extreme events, but also in longer term trends like global mean temperature, sea level rise, glacier melt. What is the role of climate change in these events and hazards that we are seeing? And the very short introduction of how we know that and what we do is, for an extreme event, we assess what is possible weather in the world we live in today. So today, where we have over 1.2 degrees of global warming already, and then compare that to what is possible weather in the world that would have been without human-induced climate change. So in a world that would have been 1.2 degrees cooler than today. And we do that by using weather observations and statistical modeling, but also climate models. And this is, on the one hand, a scientific field, and it's been one of the major new developments that has actually been provided a new line of evidence in the latest IPCC report, the AR6, where the synthesis report was published earlier this year in March. But it's also a really important way to communicate what climate change actually means. Because what attribution, and particularly attribution of extreme weather events, in essence does, it is connecting what people experience, the weather we're just seeing right now, with the often relatively abstract science of climate change. And that was the reason why we founded World Weather Attribution, because the conversation of what's the role of climate change was happening anyway when extreme weather events, particularly those with very bad impacts, were happening. But for a long time, the scientific community was very quiet in these conversations, and it was basically people with just opinions who were talking about climate change. And so the reason for founding World Weather Attribution was to bring in scientific evidence in these conversations. And so what we do with World Weather Attribution is we conduct rapid attribution studies. So while an event is still occurring or in the immediate afterward aftermath of events, we come together and answer the question whether and to what extent human-induced climate change is playing a role in the intensity and likelihood of these events. And of course, one big medium where these results are really relevant is in the global media, but not just. So within the opening remarks of the high-level opening of this year's COP, the Kenyan president talked about one of our studies, the study of the drought in East Africa that has been going on until the middle of this year and had huge impacts, and where we found with the work that we have done, led by my colleague Joyce, that without climate change, this would actually not have been a drought. It would have been a dry period, but it would not have been characterized as a drought, and definitely not as an extreme drought as the one just experienced. And so I'll hand over to Joyce to talk more about her work.
Thank you so much, Freddie. I think really the example you just gave is a success story to us in terms of communication, and that's why we have this side event with us today. So, so one goal really for World Weather Attribution, is doing these studies rapidly enough in a way that we want to be part of the conversations that people have when extreme events happen. So definitely people will start asking themselves, oh, this drought is so severe, this flooding is killing people, what's happening? What's the role of the warming of the climate here? Or even, they might not even ask those questions that sound very technical, but they could just really have conversations around what happens. Are we gonna be experiencing these much events going into the future? What happens to our agricultural productivity or even the food that we produce with these droughts happening? And for example, in East Africa, people ask these questions every time. Our agricultural production is very rain-fed, so we really rely on rainfall. And so when droughts happen, like the one that happened from around 2020 to 2023, like a whole 2 years of no rainfall in some parts of the country, people really ask questions that are critical and they're very personal, and they come to someone like me and scientists and say, Joyce, what do you have to say about this? And that is really why it's important for us to do this event, so that we bring in the conversation of the science. We bring in science in those conversations. So within all that talk and all those conversations and interactions among the different stakeholders and members of community and just the general public is the conversation of the role of climate change. So we get to say, in all these, what you're trying to say, we actually know something from a scientific point of view. We can say something about these events that we're experiencing. So that is really, really critical with the work we do at WWA. And I also want to share something else about how 2 or 3 years ago in parts of Africa, and let me talk about Kenya because I'm a Kenyan and I have like real experience about the region, is there was really little about climate change communication in the media, in the TV, in the mainstream media. When I would talk about me being a meteorologist or climate scientist, a lot of people would be like, what do you do? So what do you, are you the people who lie to us about the weather, it's gonna rain tomorrow, it's not raining? I mean, they're not very sure what we do. So, but having really started doing these attribution studies that I've really enjoyed doing and working with journalists and to communicate that, is there've been a lot of uptake of that information, and there's a lot of that reported in the current media in Kenya. And not just Kenya, because in the whole of Africa as well, we did a study of Rwanda. There were journalists from Rwanda calling me, and they wanted to publish that. People read that, it was aired in one of their media houses. So that sort of raising the awareness as well is the thing that we do, and we think that's very critical for the work that we do. And we also really trying to bring science to the people as well, to make it, to bring that sort of the human dimension of the work that we do, that it's just not the physical science, it's not about that flooding, but what is that, what does that mean, and how can policies or decision makers help to support to have conversation on how we want to reduce these impacts. What is the real question here? What kind of investments we need to do? How important are these discussions who needs to do what are the sort of the individual roles. And even in the general discussion we have here at COP, is really talking that, so Freddie mentioned that we are in the loss and damage era, and this is when we really have to talk about what needs to be done, and it has to be now. Thanks.
Thank you. So I sort of entered into this event attribution field back in 2015, and this was a year in India when there was a devastating summer heat wave. Upwards of 2,300 people lost their lives. And later in the year, there was a devastating flood in the city of Chennai, formerly known as Madras, where the city was underwater for a couple of days after torrential rainfall. And this is something that other cities in India, like Mumbai, have seen. And so the question would be, is this climate change? And of course, you would have some people say, yes, it's climate change, and the other would say, we can't attribute a single event, and we don't know, the data doesn't show this. So there was actually the two ends of the spectrum of answers, and because the science by then was strong enough that we could ask this question in a formal, scientific, rigorous way and answer it. It was an important thing that we teamed up with WWA and a few other groups to look at some of these events, and then the events that have been unfolding since then. Just last year, there was this heat wave that started in March. March and April were devastating heat waves in India that had an impact on our agriculture. So these are events that have not been in people's memories. So it's important to be able to scientifically answer whether this has been due to climate change. And the media has, over the years, picked up that it is possible to ask the question and answer it in a way that is scientifically defensible. And to a large extent, that realization that they can get scientifically rigorous answers to these questions is an important one. It's not just getting sound bites and go and talk to the two sides or three sides of a story like you would with certain other kinds of events. So this is something that I have seen that the journalists, especially in South Asia, have been extremely positively disposed to. They've reached out and wanted to learn how this is done, and so I think this has been a valuable addition. Thank you.
So I just want to say this group to my right, so 10 years ago, if you had one of these extreme events happening in 2013, and a member of the press or anyone else asked, even a scientist, a climate scientist or a journalist or a president or a premier, was this event affected by climate change or caused by climate change? And that's not exactly the right question. But the answer was always, we cannot attribute any one event to climate change. Just 10 years ago, and that wasn't true at the time, actually. The attribution science was already 10 years old. The first paper came out in 2004. There was a growing scientific literature, but the paper would come out a year or more after the event on the normal academic pace. So, this was something that former colleagues of mine observed. We did some studies that really found that there was this huge opportunity to communicate on climate change just in the first few weeks of an extreme event. But there was very little discussion about climate change that was happening because we couldn't make this specific and rigorous climate connection. So the work over the last decade, really mainly of these three colleagues and others, right, brought us to the place we are now, which is understanding that you can make statements about how climate change has made events both more severe and more likely. And that's the product of the 50+ studies, Freddie, that you've been involved in, that World Weather Attribution has done, many of which have been joined by Joyce and Krishna and many others. Climate Central was involved in the first several years. We then stepped back from the really big extreme events, but continued work on a mode of analysis that we've just kind of brought into the world that we call the Climate Shift Index, which is trying to bring this to really an everyday, everywhere science. So the climate shift to kind of complement the ongoing work from the biggest, most damaging, most newsworthy events, which continue to need kind of bespoke, specific analysis to understand deeply when the damage is that great. But at the same time, in parallel, we now have this Climate Shift Index, which puts a number on how much did climate change make more likely or less likely, right, the temperature that's being experienced anywhere, every day. So for example, here in the UAE, there's been a positive climate shift index for every single day of the COP. Climate change has made the temperatures we've been experiencing between 2 and 5 times more likely for those who have been here, kind of suffering through the heat over this last week and a half. Dubai had positive CSI every day except for one, December 1st. But somewhere in UAE there was always a fingerprint. And kind of the goal with that has been to increase the frequency even more and the immediacy even more and improve public understanding that much more by that frequency. It also opens the door to connecting climate change to heat-related impacts, right? Even when there is not the time and resources to muster a specific scientific study around it, right? Because as amazing, right? If we put all of the scientific resources, all of the climate science resources there are onto the task of attributing extreme events, we still wouldn't be able to cover them all. So we're looking together, and this is a collaboration, to find ways to, with a scientific basis, say, hey, you just had a crop failure, or declared a drought, or fires broke out. Let's look to see if there was a fingerprint on the heat in this region in the week or month or season leading up to that heat impact. So that we see as an interesting next generation. And maybe just to illustrate some of the communication dimension and impact that it's already having, if we could queue up, we have one video to share.
Let's take a look at the Climate Shift Index. This is a tool that helps us to kind of indicate whether or not climate change has influenced local temperatures.
We're at a 1 out of 5, meaning our high temperature is 1.5 times more likely tomorrow because of our changing climate.
How likely is it that climate change has its real grip on this? Pretty likely when you're up at the scale here at 4 or 5.
We're already pushing number 5 there. That's way on the edge. That shows you these are the fingerprints of climate change.
How does this tell us about the impacts of the change?
Right, so if we know that these temperatures are more likely because the climate is warmer, that can tell us about conditions like heat sickness.
Very, very hazy or milky appearance to the sky. And of course, this is all originating from the ongoing wildfires here across Western Canada. And there's most certainly a climate change link.
An alarming new report reveals Earth just had its hottest 12 months ever recorded. Researchers at the nonprofit Climate Central analyzed global averages and temperatures from November of last year through October of this year, and they found they were about 2.4 degrees above pre-industrial averages.
It has the fingerprints of climate change. A study was done by Climate Central yesterday. The heat wave we are currently in is 5 times more likely because of climate change.
Localidades como Carolina del Norte y Virginia están experimentando 4 veces más cálidas temperaturas que el promedio.
Today's extreme heat brought to you by man-made climate change. Extraordinary hot temperatures like this are made 5 to 10 times more likely because of how humans have altered the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels and enhancing the Earth's natural greenhouse effect. It's just not usually this hot this many times in the summer.
So I think to summarize, and those examples were mostly US, but this is a global thing. But to summarize, I'll say, I think that when life gives you heat waves, you can make climate lemonade in the sense that we can take extreme events and at the least use them as opportunities to understand and educate about the effects that climate change is having in different places and times. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Ben. So I think that's been a really interesting introduction, and I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and start with the first question. So I think we've heard a lot about what event attribution is and a few really exciting examples of the success that it's had, and it's kind of led me to wonder, who do you think are the core audiences for this information, and how do you reach them effectively? Do you feel you're reaching them? Is there more that needs to be done? Yeah, so who'd like to go first?
I just spoke, but everyone's looking at me.
I can also start.
You want to start?
If you feel you haven't heard my voice long enough. So I think the key audience is really everyone. So we are at the moment reaching the media a lot, but it's I would say when we do a study, we usually have a relatively high impact, and there are lots of journalists writing about our stories. But it is media like the New York Times or other outlets like that. But it's not usually your local Austin paper or your local paper in Kenya or. So I think there is still a large part of the population that doesn't know that there is actually a lot of science behind our knowledge of what loss and damage are, what the impacts of climate change are. And I think that makes it also, that's one of the reasons why it's so easy for people to say, oh, but there is no science behind, and then take any example from climate science. And I think that's a key audience that I think we need to reach more with our communication. We doing the attribution stuff, but I think climate science more in general, that it's really that it is not just a political issue, that it's not something you can have an opinion or you can just have an opinion on. And I think we have made some progress, and I think the last examples that Ben showed are really cool. So if your local weather presenter is saying this has been brought to you by our burning of fossil fuels, I think that's a really powerful thing. I wish more weather presenters on local TV would say that. But I think that is really the key audience we would need to reach, because they are ultimately the people who vote. They are the people who believe or not the narratives that policymakers are telling them. And if you understand the science, if you know there is science behind it, then you're much likely to not be persuaded by a narrative that is just not held up by the science.
I think to me, so attribution science and communicating the science of attribution it's been very interesting, and in the sense that it's actually allowed me to say more than just doing the science. So because since I started, just after science, after like my BSc on just starting to be a meteorologist, it's always been scientists, we publish our research and we don't share it that much. It's like we're saying, we have the research here, but someone else can communicate it. But I think it's having a scientist to say it and even like interact with the journalists is really so powerful. And that is a very key thing with what I've gotten from Attribution, doing these rapid studies most importantly, because then we get to talk about them. And I think that is really important. So, I mean, even with time, I learned to communicate it really well with the journalists, like to get to converse with them and get to have them understand sort of the messages that are coming from the studies that we do. So that is the first point, which I think is really important, that scientists should go beyond just analysis and publishing papers and really try to see if they can say something, especially about the climate crisis, which is really something that we think our voices can be important here. So it's not really handing over to other disciplines or other people to talk about what we've done. So I think that's important. But the other thing, who is our audience is really everyone. It's only that we engage journalists because those are the people, or we engage media because those are the people that have the outreach, they have the means to deliver the information or the messages to the general public. But our audience is anyone, actually, because it's every member of public is being affected by these crises. And I like the point that Freddie made on the narratives. So, and I think it's important first even to tie to the point that I said about scientists having to communicate the science themselves. So you have that sort of the authority to say, it's not about what the politicians tell you, but it's about me. I looked at the data and I think this is actually what's happening and it's due to this. So I think that's, yeah.
Interesting. Thanks, Joyce.
Yeah. So I want to add another audience that I've had to talk to, and this is the political establishment, in a sense, because from a developing country where we have a gazillion problems which are all competing for action and improvement on, climate change is yet another factor that kind of adds on to the list of things. So it has to compete for attention from the people that have to take cognizance of it. It doesn't always necessarily trickle down to being an issue for an election, whether it's local or national. So we have to, in some ways, be able to connect the urgency of certain problems directly. Of course, this is not to bypass the public engagement with the problem. That is definitely a part of it. It certainly is mediated in India by a vibrant media, and there's a lot of coverage for climate issues on a daily basis. So the impactfulness of what we do, clearly it needs, it's all avenues have to be pursued. So I want to add that this is something that we're trying to reach out to more of the policy makers and the technocrats and the bureaucrats that work with many things in order to appreciate the science and the problem and what we know about it. So.
And I'm going to agree with my colleagues on all of those audiences and just, I think, underscore something maybe that Joyce was just saying, which is, when people have just experienced an extreme weather event linked to climate change, I think they could interpret it as a fluke or bad weather. And so I think they're important audience, because if we can deliver the message that there was a climate change link, it means that this kind of thing is probably going to come back, right? There will be more, there will be worse in the future, and that means we have to prepare. We have to, from an adaptation perspective, think about living in a different kind of world. So I think, people who have been affected by extreme events, or people who kind of have the vision to understand it could be them, right? There's a very important adaptation-related message and audience with attribution studies. And, making it specific and connected to one event is always more powerful than speaking in generalities. I mean, your grade school English teacher, you don't need science. Like any grade school English teacher could tell you that. And so that's what we're doing with the attribution.
Thanks. Now I'm just going to turn over to the audience. If you have a burning question, do raise your hand. I think what I'll do is I'll just take a few together, and then I'll ask our panelists to respond to those they wish to. Okay, could I ask you to... No, sorry, the gentleman in the front to start with. Thank you, yeah. Oh. Will you just introduce yourself, and then, yeah. Lovely, thanks. And could you pass the mic back to this woman here? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Kalyani Raj. I'm from an NGO called All India Women's Conference in India. I was referring to your question, who will be the audience, and also to Mr. Rao's thing from India perspective, what he said. And when you say audience, I think it's the people who are suffering. They should be the first audience where the information should reach them. Because I live in Delhi myself, and I've seen how the extreme heat is affecting. And they do complain. I mean, we work a lot with the community women especially, and the lack of information is the most important thing for them. Because when we do advocacy work with them, we try to tell them about climate change. But now, fortunately or unfortunately, enough information is available. Whether right or wrong is a different matter. So I think sometimes any advocacy work or any awareness generation work with scientific proof does help our work. So from the academics, I would say that if there can be more scientific research on the matter that yes, these extreme weather situations are in some way connected to the climate change, that would really help, because that is happening repeatedly. Very often we are having drought and flood in the same year, we are having excessive rains. So the agriculture labor women, they do complain, oh, the crops really failed. We just put it and it just failed. But they are not able to sort of comprehend that it is because of the climate change. So I would say that would really help if any more scientific research is done on that, so that more awareness generation is there. Let government do their job well, but at least people like us, when we are working with the grassroots level, if that would really help us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think I'll take one more question if I just pass to your colleague there. That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Richard Jones, Met Office, Hadley Centre. So I'm going to ask about a completely different audience that to communicate to, and that's the people here at the COP, writing the text, making the decisions, doing the negotiations. You said very, very correctly that that establishing the attribution of these extreme events and the impacts of them makes it very clear that climate change is causing loss and damage. You also said very correctly that we cannot attribute all events. Now, how do you communicate to the policymakers that attribution is really central to demonstrating loss and damage, but because we cannot attribute everything, or because we can't do attribution studies on all of the impacts, that we aren't able to use attribution in the context of how you would operationalize a loss and damage fund. Seems to me quite a difficult communication thing. I'll be interested to hear reflections of the panel on that.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to hold those firstly for our panel. So we've got the first question on communication is great, but how does it lead to action? We've got a question on how can you engage more with grassroots communities to think about what this information might mean to them. And then we've got a rather large question about how do we connect this to the COP audience here, the role of the Loss and Damage Fund, and the fact that all knowledge and data is very partial, so there is a justice issue to moving forward with attribution within the loss and damage framework. I want to move things up a little bit, so should we maybe start with colleagues in the middle? Joyce, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, I'm happy to take the questions. Yeah, I will. Yeah, so you're saying linking attribution, sort of the communication that we're doing to action. I mean, I think it's one of the core goals, or I would say to me a vision of what we do for sure is that it can catalyze action for sure. So we want to eventually have this information out there that can be used by decision makers to actually take action. So for example, when we respond to these events rapidly, it's because of that, the intention is actually to make sure that people, decision makers get that information at that particular time when it's happening, when people are asking them questions. When are you relocating us from this flooded place? What resources are needed? And that is when they are digging into their pockets, they're going to the national budgets, having to reallocate resources that are not planned for this. So that means they had failed in their actions actually, or they're not prepared enough, or maybe that conversation had not happened at all. So when we do that at that particular time, I think the intention is to say that this science is actually here for you to help you make decisions better, to make you plan better for the future, and especially that now the planet is warming and we are likely to see this. 2023 was the warmest year on record. We're seeing greenhouse gases on its highest levels. We're definitely gonna experience more of these events going into the future. So what does that say about action? It definitely says we should be planning better, we should be doing action, we should be holding people accountable for their actions, and that is what we intend to do with these hands. So the whole point of doing it rapidly, to communicating it, is actually for action, if I may answer. And then there is the question on and I really like that point on getting it to the people who are actually suffering is really key, because they need to know. You're saying there are women in your community, in the village, who are being impacted by heat, the drought, the floods, and they actually can't link it to climate change. They think it's just an act of nature, and we have been talking about these events are natural. They're not natural anymore. I mean, we know that we've engineered the system in a way, and it's causing this impact. So they have, that understanding is important. I'll give you a good example of what reaching grassroots has worked for Kenya. We've been doing, but this is more on like climate information forecasting, is co-production, trying to work with them, try to make them understand, even working with indigenous communities to understand what are the complementarities in the knowledge systems, how do they understand the environment, for example, like what's the interaction, the information that we give them. And that is when you sort of now bring in and the communication of actually things have changed, even the way you are, you've been farming, for example, because of this drought has to change. It's actually the climate change. It's things are not different, and it's likely that the climate will continue giving us what it's giving us now, be it intense rainfall or droughts. And so that's how the community gets to understand and make decisions for themselves, because they do make their day-to-day decisions based on this information. And before I think I'll answer on the operationalization later, but Freddie can.
Okay, well, I can take that. I can start with that, and then because you're right, we cannot attribute every extreme event to climate change, and I think on the one hand, because not every extreme event that happens has a climate change footprint, but of course there are issues with data availability that makes it, especially in the most vulnerable countries, often more complicated. And so I think it would be completely achieving the opposite of what the Loss and Damage Fund is intending if we say, oh, we have to do an attribution study every time. But of course, still, the science is really important. And I think the science is really important to, first of all, define what events and what hazards are in scope for the Loss and Damage Fund. And that is something that we can do. So if, for example, there would be an IPCC task force on adaptation and climate impacts, we could agree on what kind of metrics we use to define these, and they would be based on attribution studies, and then define, okay, these are the types of events and the parts of the world which are in scope. That is doable right now. So, and on the other important part, where I think attribution science is crucially important with respect to loss and damage, is to estimate the size of funding that is needed. Because at the moment we've heard pledges of 100 million from UAE and 100 million from Germany, and they are the biggest ones. And then we look at extreme events that have happened where we know that climate change did play a role. Just picking one example, the floods in Pakistan last year had cost over 40 billion. And of course, not all of these impacts were because of climate change. Other factors like lack of preparedness, colonialism also played a role, but climate change did play a role. And we can use attribution studies now to get sort of an overview of what the costs actually are and what kinds of funds are needed. And I think that would be the two. Before you operationalize anything, in the operationalizing, I totally agree, there should be no attribution science. But in the setting up of the fund and deciding what's in scope and how much funding is needed, I think it's crucial.
I'm going to take that question on what kinds of action this could lead to. So just my own experience in India, the attributions of the heat waves, including the one in 2022 that I mentioned earlier, we've been talking to people who put together heat action plans. So this is something that's a fairly recent thing. It's since 2010, when one of the cities in India called Ahmedabad actually started a heat action plan where it's just that based on the weather forecast of a heat wave coming up, they would kick in certain kinds of health and civil defense and all of the other government machinery to make sure that the impacts on people is reduced. So following that, now there's close to 200 heat action plans across India, which are, some of them are city-based, some of them are local and state level. So we're working to sort of to take examples from the attribution, not just the part where we say this has been made 10 times, 100 times, 30 times more likely, but also to then look ahead with increased temperatures globally, where that will go. And if somebody says this kind of a heat event used to occur once in 3,000 years, now it's once in 100 years, you do this more, it could happen once every 5 or 50 years. So that completely changes what you have to plan for. And these are serious things that without adequate information and planning, it's almost impossible to tackle. You'll just be, but it's, again, going back to how it's easier to do it with heat waves, but what about the extreme rainfall that occurs, or the gloughs that recently just washed out a newly constructed dam? So we have lots of things that are happening, not all of which we're able to attribute, but we understand that we have to transcend, this sort of helplessness. If we don't have perfect information, we cannot act. There are things that you can do even with imperfect information. Just as long as we understand that it's imperfect, that it's got its error bars, etc., but that shouldn't stop us from action. And last point regarding connecting to as it was pointed out, the victims, the people who are suffering. So I think I've had somebody say to me, what are they going to do with that information? Is they're just going to be fatalistic about it? Oh, it's all beyond our control, so we can't do anything about it. But that's a line of thought that I don't agree with. But with sensitizing people to the causes of why certain things happen is a very important step, because then they do know that this is not natural and therefore not, to a higher power doing things to them. So I think there's a value, but it's a very difficult thing to do this across, the large scale going down to the smaller scales. But, we've been trying to do that. Recently, I was in a workshop where people were looking at all the interventions that occur in the city of Delhi and what the communities are, what the intersectionalities of how help reaches them during the heat wave, for example. So this is something that's a work in progress. Clearly, we need to be doing much more of the communicating and acting.
So let me start with Richard's question. Just to mention, so we have a paper in review right now, which has got 50 years of daily attribution data, daily attribution results on local temperatures worldwide. So that's a data set that we plan to put into the world and the next, within the next year. And our interest in it is around the communications. I sometimes say that our mission is to put climate change stickers everywhere they belong. But I think that data could be useful to lots of other entities trying to understand historical events over the last 5 decades, right? Impacts related to heat, and it's not a perfect solution, but it's one way into the question of linking different specific heat-related impacts that have happened in the world over the last 5 decades and putting a science-based kind of climate change number next to them. As for the other questions, I think part of the challenge that we're all facing, the community that's doing attribution research right now is still relatively small, and our outreach is resource constrained. And so I think to a great degree, right, we follow what I think of as a force multiplier strategy for communicating and bringing this to the world, which is working with media who have large audiences to try and increase both public and decision maker understanding of climate change. But there are other force multipliers that we can engage with, right? NGOs who are working with grassroots groups and communities, or let's say public health clinics. We have a project with an academic partner right now who connects with several dozen public health clinics around the US to bring them heat alerts and also some information that this is increasing and there's a climate change link. So I think engaging with more communities of messengers to reach end audiences is something that we can do to really improve the impact toward changing public understanding and toward action and preparation as a result of this research.
So let me jump just quickly on the answer on the question that Richard answered, and I think I'll just give my perspective as sort of being in the negotiating rooms, especially on this loss and damage, and you asked about operationalization. So I mean, really the role that I think has been very important for me being part of these conversations, especially when the fund was established last year, is just to really listen to how negotiators approach this issue, and especially in thinking about, because this it's an issue that it's involved a lot of difficult conversations, because it's about historical responsibility. Who pays? Developing countries are suffering from these losses and damages. We need a fund that can actually support them. We want to address the losses and damages that are already happening to the people. But then there are questions about how much is required, who will receive this money, and for what. And so having that attribution science, sort of the background of trying to see and understand what can the science go. So I guess what I'm trying to explain here is, at the moment, we can do attribution science at the same quality everywhere in the world, and that's the challenge, that we cannot be, for example, use attribution science to like determine eligibility, for example. So it's not a proper or a just mechanism to use to say who is eligible for these funds and who is not, because in that case, you're trying to say, will you kind of provide evidence of saying why you need to receive this money to respond to the losses and damages? Or is it related to your governance issues that you can actually have your adaptation plans in place, or is it climate change? And so that's a challenging debate, and I hear that a lot in the negotiation rooms, where like there's a bit of tension of who says what, and what needs to go into the text in terms of taking that forward, and so operationalizing the fund. But what I tell them most importantly, if I get the chance to explain, is that we know for sure that the field has helped us establish this fund. So the compelling evidence that our planet is warming, the limits to adapt, we're now beyond that, and we are seeing these losses and damages, has really helped us to have this conversation in the first place. So that's a big and a huge role. But then the other particular aspects of details that go into that, the science may not be able to address at this particular time.
I'll take another round from the floor, if people have.
On this side.
Okay, good point. On a justice issue, I now need to deal with this side of the rooms. Do we have any microphones on this side? Great. When we get it over, if we just go 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. So Joyce spoke about holding stakeholders to account, and I guess there's many different stakeholders that could be held to account, from the people producing the emissions in the first place, to regulators, to people not putting adaptation policies in place. So I was curious about climate litigation, which is a growing area, and a few points that maybe people could touch on in the panel. First of all, do you see that growing connected to your work? Do you predict it's going to grow further as something you're involved in? What does that mean for your roles as people who are already doing the science, the communication, providing the evidence to courts potentially? And also, what are the opportunities and limitations of that? We've heard about, it gets more and more complicated to try and attribute different hazards, but then the impacts when it comes to physical health, mental health, deaths, crop failures. There's these compounding risks of the climate crisis, but we know that there are these interacting factors. So what are the potentials to make those attributions into the future in the context of litigation?
Thank you. Thanks. If you just pass to your neighbour.
Hi, Robbie Parks from Columbia University. So, yeah, it was a similar related question in terms of the end of Emma's question, but public health is what I work in, and climate. So, and I sort of do studies on excess deaths, and and then the next thing people will ask me is, well, how many of those excess deaths can be attributed to climate change? And I know there's some kind of nascent sort of work on that, but I'd love to know how someone like myself and colleagues who are like-minded could be involved to add more capacity, really, because I think, just to Emma's point, I think there is there's impacts that could add to the compelling story you're telling as well in terms of people getting sick and people dying. So yeah, that's just how to get involved with things.
Thank you. And then there was just a colleague behind you there. Yeah.
I'm Stella. I'm from Northwestern University. So my question is a little bit more about misinformation in this space, and you've talked a little bit about using a variety of messengers and platforms to disseminate like the science and communicate about that science. But as we've seen with the climate crisis and other things that have come up, our science is inherently political, no matter how impartial or what the numbers say. How do you think, or how do you navigate misinformation and disinformation in this space and inoculate sort of populations ahead of time for that?
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So we've got the question on litigation, question on public health, and how can wider networks of scientists get involved, and a question on misinformation. And I also want to just chime in that I think a few of these questions are touching on this issue of what is the role of the climate scientist and scientists involved in attribution. Joyce, you touched on the importance of communications, other touching on policy use cases. So I thought it might be also interesting for you to reflect as individuals about what's your role in all of this. So who would like to kick us off? Should we start with the far end to keep things fair?
Sure, except since I'm running Climate Central, I've got to answer a little bit institutionally as opposed to individually, because we do steer clear of litigation or advocacy of any form. At the same time, and so we do the work we do in attribution because we think it's basically the most powerful way to communicate and educate about climate change and its science, because people attach to specifics and what's happening here and now. At the same time, there are a lot of phone calls that I don't return, because the research we do is inevitably very interesting, I think, to a lot of litigators. One study we did found $8 billion of damage from Hurricane Sandy could be linked to attributable sea level rise, right? Even if nothing else about this storm had a climate link, which it probably did, just the sea level starting 10 centimeters higher led to an extra 8 billion by our estimate. So I think there will be more and more attention there, I expect, as the science matures. Columbia researcher, yes, great. It's a very interesting area. Leave your card, ping us. But that, I think, we've done the climate shift index so far for temperature, but we are interested in building it out for humidity or humid heat, different measures of that, and starting to connect it to health and impacts. I think it's very important for the community to do broadly. And I think on misinformation, I'll just say, almost the answer you gave in your question is the best, which is to inoculate as much as possible, right? In a world where there are deep fakes and people think we didn't land on the moon, and I mean, so much is going on that's contra to fact right now. I don't think that climate scientists or science organizations are going to come up with any secret sauce to kind of refute misinformation. But I think the more trusted messengers we can get to talk about climate change and its effects as often as possible, right, so that it's in the air, it's in the water, right, that's helping to inoculate the environment against outrageous claims later. So, we work with TV meteorologists, for example, because, right, they are highly trusted. People invite them into their living rooms and across the ideological spectrum. So I think we do have to be sensitive. Right? In the United States, unfortunately, this is a very ideological issue. In a lot of the rest of the world, it's much less so, but there are signs. There are some places where it is a bit. There are signs that ideological division could spread. And, obviously the atmosphere doesn't care, what party or ideology you have. So the more we can find messengers who speak to people across ideology and party and who are trusted, I think that's important for us to keep a focus on.
Regarding the misinformation, I think it's not always deliberate disinformation. Sometimes it's also in how something might get reported, or some studies may be perceived. I think there's always value in making sure that the communication of results of these attribution studies is, it's properly done. Sometimes there is the looseness with which something might sound sexier if it's said a certain way. So it's certainly something that the disinformation can make it sound more robust than it probably is. So it cuts both ways. So the question on sort of the excess deaths and the epidemiological connections of extreme events. So it's a harder thing to do in certain, I know for a fact in India, it's very hard to have epidemiological data that where heat is not listed as a cause of death, right? So how do you then do these excess death calculations when your death certificates and medical records just say it died of kidney failure or something else that might have been brought on by the heat or made worse an existing precondition. So there's issues here that we're trying to work with, where the ability for us to take this into the health domain is limited by other data systems that we have to work with to be able to do that. So this is something that we face fairly commonly, especially where you go into health. This is an issue.
Yeah, so if I start with addressing the question on climate litigation. So I definitely see attribution science starting to support climate cases, and we've seen exponentially really growth in climate cases actually, and it's important because it's part of the conversation of supporting climate governance. So it's trying to see, which I think is very important, is trying to see how climate lawyers, litigators, practitioners can work together to support that kind of work, because at the moment we really need to hear from climate lawyer, for example, on what kind of evidence they will need to support some of the cases, who they're holding accountable, what kind of evidence we can provide as scientists to support that, to what limit is actually that possible within the science. So what can we say as scientists that can support their cases? So I think, and I have recently started engaging in such conversation, is really speaking with litigators and practitioners and climate lawyers to say, what exactly is happening in this field? What do we need to do? Because I think for the longest time we've been working in silos. They've been, I think the law has been a really well-established field, but then they have the way in which they do their things. But then on the climate side of things, we know how the science operates and how we produce evidence and how we do research. But then we want to say, how then can we work together and support each other? But I definitely see a role of climate attribution in that. And the other one is on misinformation. I think misinformation, the answer to misinformation to me is to continue informing, so to continue talking about this. Because it says to us that this is really an uncomfortable discussion, and people are being compelled either by their own, so be it politicians or decision makers, being compelled by their own people, whether it's members of public, whether it's people doing advocacy or anyone saying action must be taken. So they're in an uncomfortable space, and that is why you see a lot of narratives that are trying to bring misinformation. So we're really trying to water down these, or to make the climate conversation be something that is really not of importance, but it says to us for sure, I mean, it says to me as a climate scientist that I should actually continue doing what I'm doing, and I should continue even communicating it better. Yeah.
So I think in terms of the litigation, there are, I think, two important ways of how scientists can help with that, and I think where it's also to go into a bit of your where it's partly our duty to do that. So on the one hand, we can of course provide for very individual specific cases evidence of what the role of climate change or the role of the emissions of a specific emitter are. So that's something that we can do, and I think that is increasingly so. We could do a second world weather attribution just to work with lawyers and would still have way too little capacity to do that. So there is a huge demand for that. And I think it's an important opportunity because if it will not save the world, but if courts would actually say that your business model of burning these fossil fuels is actually having caused these huge damages, that I think is a powerful thing to do. And litigation risk might be something that would change how these businesses would operate if the litigation risk is too high. But I think there is, and of course that's a very specific role, and I can understand why some scientists wouldn't want to do that, because you put yourself as a witness on the line, you put yourself out to be probably attacked by the lawyers of the other side. So that is something that definitely hasn't just benefits, but I think it's an important thing to do. But I wouldn't say that it's a duty of a scientist to do that. But I think what is the duty of a scientist to do is, and that is also important for litigation, is to talk about to talk about, on the one hand, that this is possible, so that judges, who are after all members of the public, do understand that this science actually exists, that it's credible, and therefore I think that speaks to the misinformation. I think there are two things to do to counteract misinformation. One is to be transparent, to have all your data sources public, to have all your written down very clearly what you do, so that basically everyone can come and redo what you've done, and that you justify the assumptions and decisions you make. So I think transparency is one really important thing. And the other thing is we need to talk more about how science works, because a large part of the population don't know how science works. They don't know what a peer review system is, that you establish scientific facts by testing them over and over and over again with different methods, that it's not just coming up with a number. And I think that is something that we don't learn at school, how science works, what science actually distinguishes science from opinion. And I think that is just something that we as a community have to do a lot more on. And that, I think, then also would, and all this really would help also with litigation, because ultimately we have to say this as scientists, that by burning fossil fuels, we are violating basic human rights of a vast part of the globe. The Paris Agreement is not a treaty to save the polar bear. It's a human rights agreement, because the impacts of climate change are killing people, are affecting their health, and that, to just name two very basic human rights. And I think that is something that scientists, that doesn't make you an advocate if you point this out, but that is, I think, really important, and not just secretly do the science and the peer-reviewed literature.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Thank you. Could we pass over the microphone? Calling the microphone. Who's got the microphone? Missing in action. It's coming. Just here. Here we are.
Cynthia, University of Vermont. It's a really fascinating discussion. I have a couple of questions about, one is about the attribution of climate change. I mean, in the larger uncertainty question, like, how do you quantify the uncertainty in terms of the impacts, like social, environmental impacts of extreme events, and how do you bracket? Is there like a methodology that is consistent across the field? And secondly, probably a little bit more complicated question, but I'll try to explain it. So there is a lot of discussion about like if we can quantify the damage function from climate, or maybe through hindcasting experiments over the last 100 years or 150 years, or maybe to see that, okay, what kind of damages that have accrued in the last 150 years, and quantify the damage function per, like certified emission reduction per ton, for example, and quantify the uncertainty around that, that number can be used as the floor for a carbon market price. So for example, if say there's a number of like $100 per ton that's been floated around in previous IPCC assessment reports, that could be used as a floor, because right now the carbon markets or some of the previous mechanisms have used very like low floors, like in terms of like $10 per ton or $5 per ton, where basically the perception in the people coming from the south is that they're being undersold in terms of their forests and these other kinds of things. So where the attribution of climate change science can be used to really set up a floor that would actually set a scale in terms of this equity and climate justice discussions that are happening, that moving forward, at least this is what, from not only from the historical responsibility, but also in terms of the adaptation fund, and I'm of course loss and damage fund versus adaptation fund, there are a lot of complexity. I don't want to go there, but I think from the scientific perspective, if you could say that, could that be possible to set up like some kind of a number using the hindcasting experiment and some kind of bracket uncertainty around it? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Can I also, we also have a question on the virtual platform, so if I can read it out loud, if that's okay?
Please do, yes.
Okay, so it was actually sent by Crystal Franco. It's written in Portuguese, but I have translated it to English, so I will ask it, but it might not seem as grammar structured. The question is how to accelerate adaptation and local preparation with a port infrastructure project to facilitate and streamline the solutions and ambitions highlighted at COP28.
Sorry, was that specifically about ports, did you say?
Yes, with a port infrastructure project to facilitate and streamline the solutions and ambitions highlighted at COP28.
Okay, so I think it's a specific use case around marine infrastructure, which you can also take more broadly in terms of the role of attribution in adaptation. So thank you very much for your question. I think maybe to bring those together, I would also ask you that we've talked a little bit about the role of attribution science in kind of pushing the urgency of the mitigation agenda. We've touched a little bit on what role it might play in loss and damage, and I feel there's a little bit more we could perhaps draw out also, as you've mentioned, sir, on the adaptation aspect, because we've kind of heard a little bit across also the role of colonialism, pre-existing vulnerability, the complexity of poverty and the climate signal in adaptation. Like, do you feel there is some role, what role is attribution information in the context of all those things which determine how well people and communities are able to respond to climate change? So, who would like to start us off? You don't have to take all of the questions. You can jump in on which one you feel is most pressing for you.
I think maybe if I start with sort of your last question and maybe addressing, I'm not sure I got the question, the formal Portuguese question quite correct, but I think so. Ultimately, what we are aiming to do in world weather attribution, but also I think what a lot of these questions about impacts and health and so on are going towards is that ultimately we would like to understand the drivers of disasters. Ideally we wouldn't want to just stay with, okay, we can say what is the role of climate change in the hazard, but what we would really want to do is to go and say, okay, the hazard drove, a part of the, was obviously an important cause of a disaster happen, but hazards don't cause disasters by themselves. It's always a vulnerability and exposure that turn them into disasters. And we always work together with the Red Cross, so that to understand who was actually impacted by these events, and then we use that to then actually define what is the event that we are looking at, and then ask question like, was there, as well as what's the role of climate change in the hazard, is then also what was the role of early warning? Were there early warning systems? If so, did people know how to respond to them? Was there heat action plans or other action plans? If yes, did they reach all parts of the population? Where did people live? What was the role of housing, of infrastructure? So I think that's ultimately where we would want to go, and where I think we are heading towards. And of course that then, together with the role of the information of how climate is changing in the future, is what really informs where to focus adaptation, because it tells you what were the things that went wrong. So what are the most important things to do better, to withstand, to have fewer impacts of these events? And in some cases, that is already happening, and we are doing these studies. In others, it's often quite difficult because we don't have data for health impacts. We have, of course, we have beautiful damage functions in New York, where we can say that 8 billion of Hurricane Sandy were due to sea level rise, but we don't have these damage functions for across the world and for all impacts. And I think this is where some of the limitations at the moment are, and where, I think it would still be really worth trying and doing it, but it would probably be a very conservative floor that you would get with that, because a lot of the economic damages are just never actually measured. But I think it would be an important thing to do. The question is just who does it, because we are, I don't know, maybe 10 to 20 people who are doing world weather attribution, and there are not that many more people globally who work on attribution. So I think there also needs some capacity build.
I think just to react to what Freddie said is, I think really there's need for that, like, sort of inventory for these impacts going forward, so that we have, and we talking about this task force because we think a task force will do a good job other than having, like, sort of fragmented work on inventories. I know people are doing this, but I think a task force will say what metrics are we using, what indicators, what do we have, so that will support, kind of try to support that work, so that we know what is available and what is not, and what we can use, and then we know going forward then it's likely to be possible to start doing some of these things, because now we don't have this data on impacts. And yeah, as Freddie said, it could be very much available in the US or some other places, but then that's not the case everywhere in the world. And on the question that was asked online, I hope I understood correctly, but I also just said, like, in a general sense, is that so the information, for example, what we do on what comes out of like attribution is really to inform on, in a way, in informing on adaptation is, I'll give a good example of some work that I've been supporting in Kenya on combining what sort of the understanding of the risks changing in the future and developing the infrastructure. And African Development Bank now have sort of a policy that says it's not going to fund any governments if they've not done any risk assessments for, like, say, whatever infrastructure they want to put in place. So you want to say for the flooding and the drought that we experience for the flooding that we experience in parts of East Africa, for example, do we have bridges or roads that actually can, like, sustain a 1 in 100-year event, for example? So that is the kind of information that these this work we do can support. So we are saying that we know, like, likely in the future we're gonna see more of these events happening, but then is the infrastructure in place really can support this? Or do we have to be building roads every now and then and being washed away and all that? So that's the sort of the quick answer that I could give to that.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, some of the work we've been trying to do is, as you mentioned, sort of go back, hindcast, not really a hindcast, but look at what has happened in the past. It may not have led to much damage 30, 40 years ago, but to sort of imagine the kinds of events that have happened and what climate change might do to them. And so this is not really an attribution, but a projecting forward. Because there are events, as some of the world weather attribution studies have shown, that are virtually impossible without climate change. And there's probably, I don't know of ways to imagine the kinds of things that are lurking around the corner. So there's a strong possibility that we are not going to imagine everything that could happen, but the ones that did happen, how do you look at what might unfold in the future, what the statistics of those kinds of events would have been going forward? And so this is to try and help us get a picture of what is it that we are adapting to. In a sense, science for adaptation, because it's not just attributing and saying something about the past, but it's also how to inform the future.
That last point you were making, Krishna, is really interesting, because I think Freddie started explaining that the way we do attribution is basically to estimate the probability of an event happening in today's climate and divide it by the probability in a climate without extra heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere. And to do that calculation, we need the numerator. We need that first term, like the probability in today's climate. And that already, you can't just know that. It's already an extrapolation. Right? Before climate change, we used to use, an average of the last 30 years of weather statistics. But you can't use that anymore. So we already have to extrapolate effectively to the present to say, what do we think the risk of this is in kind of this year's transitory climate? And that's something that we and in attribution science, it's quite nice because it's a multi-method approach, right? There are observation-based approaches and there are model-based approaches, so there's a robustness to it. And that's something that I think we can extend at least a little bit into the future too, to get towards, there are lots of climate projections, but maybe the approach of attribution science has something to add there, looking at the next decade, let's say, a short term. The bigger question about, can we quantify all the damages? I don't think we ever will be able to. It's such a huge question, right, where everything is affected by our altered climate in some respect. But I think, there can be, we can try certain approaches, and they would be ambitious. But one is probably to study a sample of historic events and try and kind of extend from that sample, take the data set that we'll be publishing, right, and use that to say, well, how many extra degree days of heat above a threshold that damages the crop, or just try, or human health, try and find a bunch of case studies. But that's just heat. That's one thing, right? You have to do that for so many other variables. And then another approach would be to take a sort of econometric approach that, it might be analogous to what you do in looking at excess deaths, right? So we can't, we have a record of deaths and we don't know the cause of each one individually, but we see that here are two comparable periods or places, and this one had COVID and this one didn't. And so the statistically excess deaths we're going to attribute to this one thing that was really pretty different. I think that kind of work has been done with economic productivity and hurricane impacts, and it turns out if you look very closely, the effects of a bad hurricane strike on a community last decades in depressing the GDP. So is there some magic that an economist way smarter than I am could work in somehow massaging historic attribution data into some account of essentially excess or the opposite of excess, excess damages or suppressed GDP and growth? That might be quite interesting.
Thank you. We're sadly coming towards the end of the session, so the fact that the questions are still emerging I think shows just what an important and emerging area this is, both in terms of the kind of scientific excitement, but also the incredible policy relevance and communications aspects that we've heard from our brilliant panel and from such the really interesting questions from all of you on the floor. So I think, sorry, Ben, did you want to say something to conclude?
I saw one hand down there, but I don't know if we have time, though.
I was told that it was a hard line on the stop, so I think we'll have to kind of take those questions afterwards, if that's okay. So I think, yeah, with that, I'd like maybe if you could all join me in saying thank you so much to our brilliant panelists. Thank you very much.